The Marketing Review with Cambridge Marketing Colleges. Visit marketingcollege.com to see our courses.
Hello and welcome to the Marketing Review with Cambridge Marketing Colleges. I'm your host Kiran Kapur and we have a packed show for you today. We look at the Cinderella subject of distribution, how you physically get a product into the hands of your customer. We consider the fact that marketing is more of a science than an art. But first of all, we look at big data.
The Marketing Review with Cambridge Marketing Colleges. Enhance your career with Cambridge Marketing Colleges.
Big data is a subject that appeared a lot in the business and the consumer media. And I think there's a huge feeling that companies are collecting all this data on what we buy and what we do online and our behaviours, and perhaps know more about us than our mothers do. So here to enlighten us on this is Dr. Mark Roberts from Tesella. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
We normally have marketing companies on the show, and Tesella is not a marketing company. So should we start with what Tesella does?
So Tesella is a company, we're a global provider of analytics services, software development services and consultancy, particularly to R&D companies across a range of sectors in the life sciences, consumer goods, various public sector bodies, space agencies and oil companies, but all unified by a theme of science and R&D.
That's great. And one of the reasons I wanted you on was because the theme of this show is very much the fact that marketing is a science as much as an art, and there is quite a lot of rigour behind marketing. So let's talk a little bit about what big data actually is. I think there's a lot of scare stories around it.
Yes, it's a very vague term that I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with. Big data generally is the name given to the field of using large quantities of data to make better decisions, which in itself is not necessarily new, and we've been doing that for a long time. You can hundreds of years. You look at weather forecasting, for example. We've been collecting data and trying to predict what's going to happen. But I think the change that's happened recently is that the technology has got to the point where everyone can do this. Big companies, small companies, all have access to large quantities of data that they're measuring and that they can store and analyse and use to make decisions with. It's not necessarily the case that big data has to be big, which is why the name is quite so wrong. The size is just one aspect of it, and often we use 3 V's to talk about big data: volume, variety and velocity. So volume is where the big comes from. So large amounts of data present a unique challenge in how to gather it, store it and analyse it. But actually the other V's are equally as important. So variety, we're now starting to gather data from lots of different sources. There's sensors on everything. There's data sets around from public bodies and different sources of data in different formats. And then the last one, velocity, is that we're now starting to produce data very quickly. Again, if we think about sensors, we have sensors on cars, on planes and trains. And all of this data is actually, we're producing large quantities very quickly, and the speed with which you have to process that in order to make a good decision is often very important.
Oh, I see. So velocity is both the speed of getting the data and also the speed of analysing the data.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the famous examples, you've heard of CERN and the Large Hadron Collider. It's probably the world's biggest science experiment. It produces vast quantities of data very quickly in these particle collisions that happen. And actually, CERN can't even store all of that. They discard most of it as soon as it's generated because they literally can't write that much data to disk as quickly as it arrives. So they process it on the fly, and a lot of it just evaporates into thin air and never even reaches a disk. So some data comes so quickly that you can't even store it, and you have to think quite cleverly about how you deal with that.
So from a marketing point of view, do we have to be concerned about your 3 V's, the volume, the variety and the velocity?
I think so, yeah. So certainly volume. I mean, one of the typical examples of big data is often given as the Tesco Club card, the loyalty card. And for a long time, they've been gathering huge amounts of data about what people buy, when they buy it, and trying to analyse seasonal trends. So certainly volume is a big issue there. Again, with the Tesco example, variety is also very relevant. It's not just food we buy at Tesco, it's other things, home goods. There's all these lifestyle factors coming in. So they're trying to measure lots of different aspects of the same thing. Velocity, not quite so important necessarily with Tesco and supermarkets at the moment, in that a lot of the analysis happens afterwards. But we are starting to hear about people looking at things like real-time pricing. So as you are walking around the shops, then maybe the shelf label on the edge of the shelf changes the price because it knows that you might be running low on tomato soup, so it gives you a 50% discount on tomato soup as you personally walk by it. And that's where the velocity really comes in. So yeah, absolutely, those 3 V's are very relevant in that sort of retail and marketing space as well.
So this is where the consumer almost has a trade-off with I allow Tesco's or whoever to gather my data, but then I'm getting something back in that I might be getting a real-time discount.
Yes, yeah. And a lot of people, I think, are increasingly happy with that. We see people giving away huge amounts of their personal information on Facebook and the like. I'm not sure everyone realises quite how much they're giving away, but I think more so than we have before, we're increasingly ready to give away our personal data when we know that there might be something in it for us. And the experience we get, whether it's on Facebook or in the supermarket, will be more tailored to our particular needs and experiences.
So could you give me some examples of how firms actually use big data?
Yeah, okay. So big data is used everywhere. The analysis of data to make better decisions actually fits in a lot of places, in a lot of businesses. And some of the early examples that we've seen for a long time, credit card companies use it for fraud detection, for example. Millions, billions probably of credit cards transactions go through every day. Some of them are fraudulent. So being able to examine those transactions and look for things that look suspicious is actually a very difficult task, and one that they do very accurately. There's a lot of medical use of big data. You'll have heard of things like the Human Genome Project, where they mapped out the entire human genome and then using that to look for correlations and patterns between diseases and conditions that people have. There's a lot of use of big data in finance and economic modelling, literally trying to predict stock markets and working out which way things are going to go. And then more in the marketing space, probably maybe the biggest mainstream use is to profile customers. And we see that with things like the Tesco Club card.
So Mark, something we haven't discussed is privacy, and there's quite a lot of concern about companies sucking all this data out of us.
Yes, and as we said before, some people don't mind that when they see a benefit to them in terms of a more personalised experience or personalised offers and things like that coming towards them. But you're right, we are gathering huge amounts of data that do allow companies to know a lot about you and what you're doing and what you like to do. And it's also the case that sometimes the anonymous collection of data is not quite as anonymous as it seems. So one of the things that big data tools are very good at is joining different data sets from different places. And one of the things we see quite frequently is you can take 2 or 3 different anonymous data sets, join them together, but as a whole you can actually then start to identify individual people. And that obviously presents a big problem, because a lot of people are only handing this data over on the understanding that it is anonymous. But we see time and again that we can de-anonymise data through the very big data tools that we're using to give advantages to the customer as well.
So is that something the industry just needs to be aware of?
Yeah, I think it's something the industry needs to be aware of, especially we see it in the medical area where people are very sensitive about giving information away, especially if it could potentially be de-anonymised, because obviously people don't want that sort of information escaping. So
again, all this data is around, and I believe Tesla have a mantra that's something like decisions first, data second. So
yeah.
How does that work?
Yeah, so decisions first, data last, we call it, which is a sort of a useful filter. I think with the big data explosion that happened, lots of people are gathering lots of data, as I said. It's easy just to go on what we call a fishing expedition and just looking at data to try and find something interesting. More often than not, that doesn't work. You may find relationships in there, but they don't really tell you anything. We've found through experience that it's much better to start with a question in mind. What am I actually trying to do? So in the case of Tesco, for example, they're trying to, at the end of the day, increase sales. So you can then start to look at this a lot like a science experiment. You say, here's what I'm trying to find out, or a question I'm trying to answer. This is the data I would need to answer that question. Go away and gather it and then analyse it and draw your conclusion and answer it. And just having that sort of scientific methodology to your data analysis is a much better way to go than just blindly fishing around in the data. So, let's say the decisions first, data last mantra is really just, in its full title, is probably think of decisions first and then think what data you need last, rather than having it the other way around.
So rather than thinking, I could collect all this wonderful stuff and then perhaps see if anything comes out of it at all.
And that's not to say that doesn't sometimes work, and speculatively collecting data in case you might need it for a future purpose is not necessarily a bad idea all the time. But you may find yourself drowning in data, and it's not cheap to store large quantities of data, and you need to really think carefully about how you organise and manage it. Otherwise, you may find yourself swamped by data and not able to even find the right data or put your finger on the data that you need. So just blindly collecting it might cause yourself trouble down the line.
So one of the things you said was that big data is misnamed because it's not always big. So how big is big?
Okay, so big data can be very big. So at extreme ends, we see in some of the sort of scientific work that we do, for example, there's a new telescope being built called the Square Kilometre Array, which is literally a telescope that's a square kilometre in surface area. And that will produce data in the range of what we call exabytes. And an exabyte is not a term that most people have heard of. You may have heard of gigabytes and maybe terabytes in the PC on your desk there. A petabyte is 1,000 terabytes, and an exabyte is 1,000 petabytes. So really, an exabyte is 1,000,000 terabytes, and it's a volume of data that most people can't even comprehend.
Yes.
So at that extreme end, you have people working with exabytes and petabytes. But like I said, size is not the most meaningful thing to look at here, and we often find that great insight can come from small amounts of data as well. Again, if you apply that decisions first, data last mantra, you often find, when you think about it methodically, that you don't need to gather 100 exabytes of data. You can actually just gather a very specific set of data and answer the question that you want very concisely.
And is there somewhere where I have to store this data specifically in order to be able to analyse it?
Yeah, so again, that's another good question, and another reason why we've seen a bit of an explosion recently in this is because there are more options for storage now. It used to be that only big corporations that had their own in-house data centres could even consider storing this sort of volume of data. Now we see a lot of what's called cloud computing. People are able to store their data on remote servers hosted by other companies at very reasonable storage costs. So even a small startup company can store large amounts of data up in the cloud and apply these same sorts of analytical tools.
Having discovered how we can store the data, how do I go about analysing my data?
Okay, so the first obvious response would be that you should employ an expert like we are. There is actually a new breed of people coming through called data scientists, and I don't know if you've come across the term data scientist before, but it's generally used to refer to someone who has skills in statistics and data analysis, has some knowledge of the domain that you're working in, and also some technical skills to actually implement solutions, whether that's writing programs or scripts, or maybe even just someone who's very good at using Excel and drawing tables and charts and looking at how you can model data like that. So there's a growing breed of these data scientists that are finding roles within different companies at different levels. And the sorts of tools that they use, again, this is something where the big data explosion has actually largely been driven by free and open source tools that are as available to the small startup company as they are to a big corporation. For example, one of the major tools used is called Hadoop, which is a funny word in itself, but it's an open source tool originally developed by Google and then further developed by Yahoo and then released to the world for everyone to use for free. And Hadoop forms the basis of many of the big data solutions that are around, and it's entirely open and accessible to anyone who wants to use it. So there seems to be at the moment a groundswell of free and open source tools around that ecosystem that anyone with the requisite training can start to use.
Excellent. Mark, thank you very much. That was very enlightening on big data. And that was Dr. Mark Roberts from Tesella.com.
The Marketing Review with Cambridge Marketing Colleges. Visit marketingcollege.com to see our courses.
Mark discussed the analytical side of data, and that sets up the review section where I wanted to look at how marketing is as much a science as an art. There is a huge view that marketing is just people sitting around in a room being creative. I once had it described as working for the colouring department. But actually there's a huge element of scientific rigour which needs to go on behind that creativity. And a number of our guests have brought this out. Andrew Hatcher, who was on the show last time, talked about that we need to be rigorous in analysing our data and that we should analyse things that we are scared of. And this is something marketers can be very bad at doing, but it's very important. Marketing is a cost centre. It can be an area of the company that costs quite a lot of money, and we need to be seen to be analysing what we're doing so that we can justify what we do. And the analysis can come in many ways. Andrew came up with the idea of metrics. When Kiran Kapur came on and talked about email marketing, he talked about how that we can test ideas. He said that with email marketing, if you put out something on a Monday morning, you know by Monday evening and certainly by Tuesday if it's working. So you can always take a section of your email marketing campaign and actually analyse and test something. Does this headline work? Does this body copy work? And if it does, you can then add that into the rest of the campaign. And his view was almost every email campaign you did, you should be testing some element to see if you can make the campaigns better. And this is all part of being both creative, but also having a rigorous analysis that goes on behind that creativity. Of course, there are dangers in analysing data. Mark Roberts from Tesella was talking about drowning in data and the dangers of that. And you can get in a situation where you can get in what we describe as analysis paralysis, where we actually get so concerned about analysing the data we never actually get round to doing anything. And Andrew Hatcher talked about the dangers of vanity metrics, that we go around measuring things that look very exciting, but actually aren't really relevant to what we're trying to achieve. So overall, there is a balance to be found in marketing between the rigorous side and the creative side, but we do need to make our creativity work on the back of some fairly rigorous data analysis and analysing of what we do and what works. Of course, analysing and analysis on the scientific side of marketing is often not seen as sexy and as exciting as the creative side, however important it is. And another area of marketing which is very important but also not necessarily seen as particularly sexy or exciting is distribution, which is how we physically get our product from where we create it into the hands of our customer. And my next guest gets very excited about distribution, so excited he's written an entire handbook about it. Karl Meyer, welcome to the show. I think it's fair to say distribution is a bit of a less exciting, less sexy element of marketing. Is that fair?
I don't think so. I actually personally find it really, really fascinating. It's an area where a lot of people don't think too much about distribution. But if you actually delve into it, it can be a very interesting subject in its own right.
Go on then, tell me exactly what distribution is.
Well, when people hear the word distribution, they often think, oh, that's just shipping stuff around the country and, you know, a bunch of lorries and parcels and stuff like that. But in a business and a marketing sense, it's a very different animal. It's very much the chain of organisations and businesses between the raw manufacturer and the end user. So that can be manufacturers, wholesalers, retailers, and then down to the end customer. And each of those relationships has a different dynamic about it, and organisations have to manage those dynamics across the entire chain.
Okay, so let's go back a stage, because you use some words there like wholesalers and retailers and distributors. So can you give me an example of a product that perhaps goes through this chain?
Well, a simple product that everybody sees every day is milk. You have a farmer who manufactures the milk. He then sells that to a processor who takes that and pasteurises, turns it into the various kinds of milk and cream and butter and everything else that we buy. Then that goes through a wholesale channel, and then wholesalers, your corner shop, goes and buys that from a cash and carry, and then it's delivered to them on a daily basis, and then you buy it as a retailer. And that is a value chain. So each of those individual parts of the chain are adding their own particular value to that product as it goes through till it actually turns up on your table in the morning.
So does each of that part of the chain also add a bit to the price of it?
Yes, usually it does. And there is a whole area of distribution called disintermediation, which is a fascinating subject in itself. But yes, each part of that does add price to that chain. But that comes there's a value to that, because you as an individual couldn't go to your local farm and say, can I have 2 pints of milk today? They simply wouldn't want to sell it to you in 2 pints because they don't have the systems and the mechanisms and the processes to do that. So your ability to buy milk in 1 and 2 and 4 pints, in skimmed and semi-skimmed and full fat and so on, is the value that is reflected in the price that you're paying relative to the price that the processor is buying it from the farmer.
And the fact that I can go to a supermarket and buy my milk along with everything else in my weekly shop.
Absolutely, that is another value. You don't have to go around and buy your milk from one place and your bread from another place and your eggs from somewhere else and so on and so on and so on, and go to the farmer and arrange for a cow to be slaughtered so you can have some steaks for that evening. You're getting a value by being able to buy these things all in one place. And yes, you're paying extra than the wholesale price, but you're getting something, you're saving time and you're making your life simpler. So that is where you're getting the value from.
You use the word disintermediary, so now I've got to ask you, what is that?
Disintermediation is a fantastic phrase and a system which is particularly used in the internet. Basically, if you have a value chain from a manufacturer all the way down to an end user, you have intermediaries. You have the processor, the manufacturer, the wholesaler, the retailer. By disintermediation, you can actually remove some of those intermediaries. The most common one that many people have seen is Amazon. Essentially, Amazon is a huge book warehouse. And usually book warehouses used to send books to a high street bookshop. You then went to the high street bookshop and bought your books. Amazon is disintermediating that process by removing the bookshop from that process. You order direct from the warehouse, essentially. There is another level beyond Amazon, which is the actual book publishers. That is much harder to go for in terms of disintermediation. It's very much harder to remove Amazon from that link, simply because you know the title of the book, or you fancy a science fiction book or a romance book or 50 Shades of Grey or whatever you want. You may not actually know the publisher of that book. You don't care what the name of the publisher of that book is. So Amazon adds value by taking books from a variety of publishers and a variety of formats and offers them in one place where you can then select the books that you want, put them into a box, and then that box gets shipped to you. So that's where Amazon is still adding its value by being an intermediary in that process. But it has also disintermediated the bookshop in the high street, because that is no longer needed.
We're talking a lot about consumers, so how we get a product to a consumer. So is there anything different in distribution if I'm selling from a business to a business?
Yes, there is. It's a huge amount. I spent 10 years of my life working in the reseller market in IT, selling business to business. And in that area, there's a whole different set of values that are being added. As an example, my organisation was selling internet connectivity into businesses. Now, we used a reseller channel to take that. The resellers would then take that raw connectivity, add their own software, their own hardware, their own skills onto that to provide a web hosting system or a secure internet connectivity to a business, or add mail servers onto the end of it so they can actually connect and use their email and so forth. So those guys were adding value by adding personal skills, by adding other software and other hardware from other manufacturers, and pulling the whole lot into one whole that then could be sold on. And that is another aspect of distribution, and they're adding their value in that particular place. But as a marketer, you need to work out how to market both to the reseller and to the end user. You then have actually two audiences that you have to market to, and they have to market to them in different ways.
I'm glad you mentioned marketing, because we've talked a lot about distribution. So where does marketing come into all of this?
Well, marketing in a distributed system is much more complicated because you have different audiences. If you are the manufacturer of a product, say, for example, the internet connectivity, you have to market to the resellers. You have to give those guys a bunch of value statements, a bunch of value propositions that they understand, which makes them select your product compared to any other supplier's product. You then have to work with those guys to market the overall solutions to the end user. So you're talking at two different audiences and two different types of message. A reseller is interested in a number of things. They're interested in a low risk solution for them. They're interested in a high margin solution for them. They want to make money. The end user is looking at a different set of value statements. They buy through a different process to the process that the resellers are selecting you as a supplier.
So, Karl, is the marketing and distribution the same for both business to consumer and business to business?
They're related, but they do have different tendencies there. One of which in the consumer market is that there's a great deal more pull marketing, whereby the raw manufacturer or the supplier will try and generate demand from the end user. So in terms of books or CDs or whatever, they will try and persuade the users to want to buy the product. In consumer goods, TV adverts for butter or whatever will ask people to buy that particular product. That will generate demand. They will then use that so that the retailers will go, oh, there's a TV advert for this, there's a lot of play time for a particular track, I need to make sure I have those CDs on the shelves, I need to have that product on the shelves, and they are generating demand through the pull marketing. In a business sense, you end up with a little bit more push as well as pull. So you would be, as a supplier, pushing and marketing to the resellers or to the distributors to persuade them to take your product. You may also do some pull marketing to make sure that the users will understand what the product is, to recognize the name of it so that they're not buying a no-name brand. They're actually saying, oh yeah, I recognize that, I believe I see some value in that product. But you have a much more balanced combination of push and pull marketing within the business-to-business market than you may necessarily have in the business-to-consumer market.
So, Karl, are there any conflicts that can happen down a distribution chain? I can see lots of bits in this chain.
Yes, channel conflict is a huge issue. There's two kinds of channel conflict that you can see. The first is where a supplier decides, yes, I want to sell to retailers, and so therefore they have a retailer channel where the product goes from the supplier to the retailer to the end user. And they go, but I can make more money by selling direct to the consumer myself. And they try and run two channels simultaneously. And so they think, I can take the margin that the retailer would usually make and wrap that into my own margin. And of course, then the retailers get very upset about this because they see, well, hang on a minute, you're trying to persuade me to take your product, to commit to your product, to give you money, and then market and promote your product. Yet you're actually selling it yourself. So why should I take your product on? What is in it for me? Am I just acting as part of your marketing stream and you're just taking the money? So there's a great deal of conflict there. Other types of conflict, particularly in the business-to-business market in terms of resellers, are if you are a supplier of a raw material, a relatively commodity product, commodity service, if you are then looking at a conflict there because other suppliers will be going into that same reseller and saying, I can sell you a pretty much same product, but I'll give you an extra 2 or 3% margin on that product. You've then got a conflict there because the reseller isn't actually part of your organisation, isn't really thoroughly committed to your product. They are committed to making money for themselves. So you have an issue there of conflict that you could work very hard with a reseller, develop their business, train their staff, make them thoroughly aware of the pros and cons of a particular technology or a particular marketplace or whatever. Another manufacturer says, fantastic, you've done all the hard work. I'm going to come in and I'm going to sell a product and give them 3 or 4% extra margin on selling the product. You've done all my job for me. That's great. So there's two levels of conflict there. It's a bit of a battleground sometimes, I think.
And is this something marketing has to just be aware of?
No, I think it's something that marketing can take a very strong part in playing because you need to be able to put together the value statements and the benefit statements to persuade customers and distributors and retailers this is a valuable product to you. We are offering you a great deal through this, not just necessarily in terms of percentage of margin and profit and so forth, but in terms of risk. We are a strong supplier. We are a low risk supplier. If you sell our product rather than somebody else's product, you're going to get less returns, less issues, less problems. That is going to be valuable to you. And that's where marketing can play a great part, by strengthening that value proposition.
Carl, that was really interesting on distribution. Thank you for coming on to enlighten us on that.
My pleasure.
And if that's whetted your appetite, Carl has written a distribution handbook, which is available from Amazon, which your retailer that you mentioned earlier.
The Marketing Review with Cambridge Marketing Colleges. Enhance your career with Cambridge Marketing Colleges.
And that's it for the show this time. If you would like some more information, or you'd like to listen to any of our previous shows again, then head over to star107.co.uk, where you can do just that. If you want to get in touch with the show, you can do that via the Cambridge Marketing Review Facebook page or at CMC Points of View on Twitter. I've been your host, Kiran Kapur. Many thanks for listening, and I'll be back again in 2 weeks' time.
The Marketing Review with Cambridge Marketing Colleges. Visit marketingcollege.com to see our courses.